Good evening, everyone. And if you're joining us from the US, good morning. If you're joining us via our YouTube site at the FCC, uh, good day or whatever time it is. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Keith Richburg. I'm the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong. And our guest today, I'm very honored to welcome Ambassador Christopher Hill. You know, as we move away from President Trump's America First foreign policy, President Biden has adopted a new approach that involves a foreign policy for the middle class, build back better. We have heard, and that emphasizes working with allies instead of sometimes antagonizing them, as has happened in the past administration. What lies ahead as the Biden administration navigates this increasingly complex relationship with China and other parts of the region is the subject for our speaker today, Ambassador Christopher Robert Hill. Ambassador Hill is a career foreign diplomat who joined Columbia University's School of International Public Policy as the George W. Ball Adjunct Professor in the spring of 2021, so just now. And previously, he was the dean of the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Previously, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs from 2005 until 2009. He also headed the delegation to the Six-Party Talk, where many journalists out here in the region, many of you watching this, got to know him very, very well because he used to come out of Pyongyang and give us some briefings, let us know what was going on. He was also a four-time ambassador to Iraq, South Korea, Poland, Macedonia, and he was previously the Secretary of State's Distinguished Medal of Honor winner. He speaks Polish, Serbo-Croatian, Macedonian. I don't see Korean on the list, but I'm sure it's in there somewhere. I'm sure he's picked up a little bit of that as well. Ambassador Hill, thank you very much for joining us. I think the last time we talked, we were both at Princeton. I was there teaching journalism, and you were there as a fellow. So it's really good to see you again. Thank you for joining us here in Hong Kong, where we are, New York, where you are. Thank you. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Keith. It's always a pleasure to be in Hong Kong, even if it's virtual. So, real pleasure to talk to you and the members who I've actually spoken to the Foreign Correspondents Club in the past. So great to be back, so to speak.
Well, you're an old friend of the club, so thank you, Ambassador Hill. And if you don't mind, let's just jump right into it. We've got a really good turnout tonight, so people really want to know what's going on with the Biden administration, what's going to go on with the Biden administration, with Asia and the region. But before I get to Asia, which is the specialty here and the subject of tonight's talk, can I just ask you to look generally at foreign policy? Can you just give us an overview of the foreign policy landscape that the Biden administration inherits, and to put a positive spin on it? In a past talk that I've done, that I hosted here, someone asked a question. Some member of our membership asked a question, and I'll pose it this way to make it a positive spin. They said, "Did the Trump administration do anything right?"
Eisenhower once asked that question of his vice president, Richard Nixon, and the answer was, "Give me a week and I'll think of something." But, seriously, though, there's an old line that lawyers look backwards and diplomats look forward. And so, you don't try to, you try not to spend a lot of time looking at the sins of your predecessors or whatever. You try to look forward. I would be remiss, however, if I did not acknowledge that considerable damage, frankly speaking, was done to our capacities around the world. Whether there is a positive side to this damage would take me a while to articulate, but I will say, as the slogan of the Biden administration suggests, that is foreign policy for the middle class, I think there is some effort, and it did start during the Trump administration, to kind of connect American people a little better to what is going on in foreign policy. I think the Trump administration connected people to the notion that somehow we've been abused out there. Countries have taken our assistance money and not returned increments of security, et cetera, et cetera. And so this kind of concept that we have been taken advantage of, I think it's the wrong concept, but I think he's trying to engage American people in a subject that they do need to be better engaged in, because I think we live in an age where, and I can speak for people in the United States, that everybody has an opinion about something. And you better do a good job of explaining what it is you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of blowback.
Yeah. And so is it fair to say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, that everything then was kind of transactional? How much money are you giving us for these troops? How much money are you going to pay us for these bases? Is that what was the problem before?
I think that was certainly the indictment of the Trump administration, that it was transactional. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that. If you look at how they handled the military presence in countries like Korea or in South Korea or countries like Germany, there was somehow this notion of, we're providing the military and you ought to provide us something like money or something. And in fact, there are a lot of nasty negotiations on that score. Whereas I think it is a bit of a misunderstanding to suggest that the United States has troops in Korea for just Korea's benefit. It's very much also for ours. And I think that very much goes for NATO. And this president that we have now, Joe Biden, understands that in a way that, frankly, few people have understood it. And I think his task is to try to do a better job, a much better job than his predecessor, in explaining this to the American people, and why foreign aid is not just an outflow to other countries, but rather helps America navigate the world, because we're not going to be able to put up walls and prevent us from dealing with the world.
Well, thank you for that. And let's dig in a little bit deeper. Let's start with China, because that's the biggest, obviously, question on the foreign policy agenda. And let me just start this way. I mean, there used to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, there used to be what we called the foreign policy consensus about China. The more we engaged, the more that we brought China into the fold, the more they engaged in these international organizations that were set up, the more they would change, the more China would become, if I may say, more like us. The more open it would become, the more liberal, the more democratic it would become. That was the consensus for 20, 30 years of engagement with China. Has that changed now?
Well, yes, it has. There is a consensus, though, and you see this, Democrats and Republicans alike, that somehow China has abused some of our approaches to China, and that China has somehow managed to be very aggressive in the trade front, be very aggressive on intellectual property rights, and to be very aggressive strategically, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's relations with neighboring states in Asia. But also China is very, very aggressive economically with its Belt and Road Initiative, and also in Europe. You see a lot of countries, if you take Serbia, that you wouldn't actually think of in terms of China policy, and the degree to which China is very popular in Serbia because it provides a lot of investment, doesn't ask a lot of questions, doesn't tell them what to do on human rights, issues like that. So China is a very strong competitor. My own view is, I like to think, is a lot more nuanced. I do believe that we need to find patterns of cooperation with China. And I do believe that we're going to have to talk to China. I mean, one of the great frustrations for me was watching our previous Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, go some 2 years without visiting China because he was a little offended at how they had treated him 2 years before. So I think China is today front and center, probably the number one foreign policy issue that this administration has to deal with. And with the understanding that we can no more change China than China can change us, what we have to do is shape the international environment in which China grows. And in so doing, we're going to have to work with others, and we can't just do this by ourselves.
Yeah, well, how do you see the Biden administration's approach to China? Because the Obama administration had the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was supposed to, loop in this group of a dozen allies to kind of keep China kind of contained, or at least try and show China there was a different approach. Biden actually campaigned against TPP. Both he and other Democrats said TPP was a bad idea. I mean, do we go back to TPP, or what's the new approach?
Well, Keith, I don't think we're going back to TPP, but maybe for somewhat different reasons. When you look at the American kind of political system, when you look at how the degree of economic transformation within the U.S. economy, there is a view shared by Democrats and Republicans that somehow these international trade agreements have resulted in the situation where the U.S. has been a net loser. And I don't think is so much a question of, gee, our negotiators ought to be a little better or something. I don't think it's a question of working on the margin. I think it's a question that many Americans have, Democrats and Republicans, that somehow in the end, we can't manage these things with our very open system and working with much more closed systems. At the time, Trans-Pacific Partnership, especially by the people who negotiated with it, I think did a really fabulous job. They brought in elements of trade that had been dealt with in the past, but not as much as they were in TPP, whether we're talking service sector or IPR, et cetera. I thought it was very, very well done. But when you took it back to the American people, there was a real sense that it wasn't. So I don't think we're going to go back to that. I think we're going to have to go forward with better kind of arrangements with countries, which is to say, to a country like China, you're running these enormous surpluses with us. We know, we've also studied Economics 101. We know that you can't just look at bilateral deficits as a measurement of whether you have a good trading system. But at some point, and I think we've passed that point, where you have to say, this is not sustainable. This cannot go on. You cannot expect American workers to be, getting out of industry, hard industries into post-industrial sectors. A lot of transformation, which, by the way, has nothing to do with China. And you can't expect people to be going through these very wrenching times, and you throw in a COVID situation on top of it, especially in that service sector. You cannot expect them to go through that and not have someone that they're kind of blaming. And I think so China became the sort of country that everyone said, wait a minute, it's not just structural transformation we're going through, it's Chinese inspired. So there needs to be a meeting of the minds on this. And China does need to understand that, it would have a problem, let alone us having a problem right now.
Sure. And for listeners and viewers here what is the Quad, and is that a replacement architecture for this region?
I think the Quad is an important initiative to bring India into the East Asia equation. It's a little, historically, there's not a lot of India. It kind of stopped at Singapore. If you go to Singapore, you see it there, but you don't see it much beyond Singapore. So this is kind of a notion that somehow India has a role to play in East Asia. It's very much dependent, interested in the trade routes, et cetera, that it has a role. However, there are those, and I'm afraid to say the Chinese are among them, that somehow believe that bringing India into the equation is a kind of crude effort to encircle China. And so I don't think India wants to be a part of that. I don't think it's a sustainable policy for those who think that's a good idea. I think it needs to be done much more with sort of softer measures, not looking at the world in sort of strategic military terms and saying that we need India to somehow build that part of a wall. So I think the issue is people look at the same thing and come to different conclusions. And that, by the way, that's not unusual in foreign policy.
Okay. So you're not a huge fan of the Quad then?
I don't want to have it come down to that. I'm just a huge fan of having India a part of the process and not having any misunderstandings as to why it's part of the process.
Sure. And let's break down some of the issues with China that some of which you touched on. I mean, let's start with South China Sea. I mean, and the big question everybody has is, are we looking at a potential military conflict there between China and the US?
Um, I don't think anything like that is imminent. I think people are aware of the dangers. So that's not something that keeps me up at night. I think the concern is, however, that China has taken something that it has long had a claim to. I mean,
Mhm.
whether you agree with the claim or not, this didn't just happen last week. And
Mhm.
so, what is concerning, of course, is the unilateral efforts to affect its claim. This
Mhm.
non-dash line. And by the way, these issues have been around for a couple of decades now, but the
Mhm.
claim is older than that.
Right.
I don't like the way China has managed the Southeast Asian nations on this.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, the idea, China had a kind of idea, they kind of pick them off one by one. By the
Mhm.
way, that hasn't really worked. And I think the best way these issues can work is to have a greater sense of institutional, or I should say multilateral institutionalization. You look at these old claims in Europe, and by the way, there are a lot of them. I mean, I don't care if it's Slovenia and Croatia or Spain, and these things
Mhm.
are all over Europe. Somehow they've managed to park them into these
Mhm.
various mechanisms that emerge from the European Union, and nothing gets
Mhm.
dangerous.
Mhm.
In the case of the South China Sea, there's a lot of concern, and I would urge an understanding by all parties that people need to realize that you don't change the status quo by unilateral means. And
Mhm.
so the U.S. has insisted, and quite properly in my view, that it has concerns about freedom of navigation. The Chinese have said, "Oh no, this has nothing to do with freedom of navigation." Well, I'm sorry, it does. And so there needs to be, I think, a much calmer effort to go through these
Mhm.
issues. And just because you can assert in unilateral efforts on a place doesn't mean you have to do that. And by the way, it's not just that China is somehow creating facts on the ground. In some cases, it's actually created the ground itself by putting dirt on top of these atolls and building facilities. That's a recipe for greater
Mhm.
tension.
Sure, and I agree. Nobody really wants or expects there to be a military conflict there. But what about the possibility of just an accident? You got a lot of ships, a lot of planes in a very small area. Is that a danger?
Uh, to me, if you look through history at various wars, various conflicts,
Mhm.
accidents are often among the causes. And you don't have to spend a lot of time in the Balkans to understand that. So, yes, I do worry about accidents. I worry about capacities of very heavily armed and, frankly, tense militaries being concerned when they see things. We know that we've had some rough times in the past. You recall the
Mhm.
beginning of the George W. Bush administration when there was essentially a mid-air collision with a Chinese jet, a U.S.
Right.
Surveillance plane. So there's reason to be concerned about it. However, there's reason to understand that people are well aware of the dangers.
Sure. So South China Sea doesn't keep you up at night. What about Taiwan? What do you think China is going to do? What do you think China's intentions are? Does that keep you up at night?
Well, yeah, it does. A lot of things keep me up at night, but yes, that is one of them. But to answer that question, you're going to have to ask the Chinese what they see. I must say, if you kind of look at this from a broad and multi-decade perspective, the notion was that somehow what emerged in Hong Kong would somehow, some way or another, be some kind of perhaps starting point for a model of what can emerge in Taiwan. And
Mhm.
so I think that helped people sleep at night because there's this concept that, okay, we all know how this someday will end up. I think there's a lot of concern today that, for obvious reasons, that's not all, those pieces are not all fitting together. So the question is, how do you square a Chinese concept of sovereignty with a increasing Taiwan concept of self-determination? So it's not an easy issue, but I think given the stakes, given the enormous economic investment stakes, given the whole cultural issues, given the whole emergence of East Asia as a community, if not, maybe not a community in the sense that the Europeans have succeeded, but there's a much greater sense of community in East Asia than there was in the past. I think it's important to try to work these issues through and calm them down. I'm
Yeah,
from the calm things down school of thought. I grew up with four siblings, and the way we manage things was let's everyone calm down. I think it's good advice in large multi-sibling families, and it's good advice in diplomacy.
it's good advice. I'm an only child, so thank you for
Oh, good.
sharing
Yeah, I'm just giving you a tip. Yeah.
that. Thank you very much. When we've got Hong Kong, where people have been concerned about a rollback of freedoms. We've got Xinjiang, which you know about. People have been concerned about these kind of re-education camps. When you look at Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, China will respond saying that's our internal affairs. America has no right to talk about anything involving our internal affairs. I mean, what what is the response to that? And does the U.S. really have any kind of pressure points they can push when it comes to these kind of issues that China considers their internal affairs?
Yeah, I think the concept of such and such is an internal affair and therefore beyond the ability of anyone else to comment on is a wee bit antiquated at this point. Now, what the Chinese often suggest, and I think it's wrong, I think it's very
Mhm.
wrong, is that somehow international standards are just a wholesale input or import of American standards.
Mhm.
And somehow, therefore, international standards are not uh, ones to follow because the US has essentially taken its own and rammed them down the throat of others. I don't think that's frankly true. And if the other argument that one hears from the Chinese is, hey, you talk about Xinjiang, but look at your problems, look at your race relations, I get it. I understand why that would be a good debater point, but I'm not sure that really gets at the issue either.
Mhm.
Countries have internal problems that impede, that touch upon international standards. And I think some of the problems that China is facing are ones that it has to solve in the context of international standards.
Mhm.
Does the US have problems? Yes. And if China wants to talk to them, fine. But that doesn't change the situation of what's gone on in Shenzhen.
Mhm. Yeah, and can we talk about that just a little bit, because I actually had a couple of questions later on, but it's a good time because you brought that up about the U.S.'s internal problems. Number one, we see a lot in the Chinese media. We've heard it at the last the Lianghui, the National People's Congress, the meetings that went on in March. Chinese officials saying, look at how the U.S. handled the pandemic. You guys were a disaster zone. We did the hard measures. We did the hard yards. We shut things down and we got it under control. You guys can't talk anymore. Look at your race relations. Look at the George Floyd murder and the trial of the police officer going on right now. So you guys can't lecture us. They said this during the Alaska meetings, et cetera. How much do we have to get our American house in order before the Chinese might listen, or before we can criticize the Chinese?
I mean, for any country, not just the United States, to address its domestic issues, is not a question of whether in addressing the domestic issues you can somehow weaponize them for the purpose of attacking or criticizing some other country. You need to address your domestic issues regardless of whether you are engaged in some issues with other countries or not. I think a lot of countries have a lot to offer in terms of how they've addressed domestic issues. There are many aspects of race relations in the US that I think Americans should feel proud of if you step back and look at progress that has been made. There is a great deal of unfinished business, and I don't think any American should shirk from that understanding. The idea that we've had problems with police minority relations, that's not a new issue. And I would add, as someone who's served in a lot of foreign countries, it's not unique to the United States. I think the issue is whether you are addressing your problems and whether you're trying to make those steps forward rather than backwards. And frankly speaking, I think in the sort of scope of history, the US is moving forward on them. But I think we all, as Americans, should feel a sense that we need to continue to move forward. I don't get the sense that that's necessarily what every country thinks about their own domestic problems. And I think to kind of hold them up and try to get into these sort of kitchen debates of who's got a better situation, I don't know if that's all that helpful. I do believe that, the America, we have certainly a complex history, and just our origin, whether you go back to 17th century missionaries, whether it's the Pilgrims or the Puritans or whatever, we have this kind of notion that somehow there's a foundation of morality. Some other countries don't feel we live up to it. Fine, they're free to criticize us. But I don't think anyone should ever expect the US to abandon the foundation on which the country is made, and this foundation that ideas and morality matter. I think we'll continue to do that. And rather than take it personally, I think countries should understand that it's basically our DNA. You can sort of have fun when you see us slipping up and not getting the job done in these areas, fine. But don't expect to change us on how we see ourselves. It's really not a good endeavor.
Yeah. Do you see, if you look kind of forward, do you see a kind of a decoupling between the United States and China? I mean, a decade ago, they were talking about this, combined Chamerica, China, America were too intertwined. Are we decoupling?
I don't see that. I certainly see some voices in favor of that kind of approach. I think they are complementary countries in an economic sense. I think there is much we can work on together. I think we can, this idea, to me, there's a little fake history involved. I hate that word fake. I thought we got rid of that, but whatever. I think, for most Americans, to talk about the Peloponnesian Wars and to be quoting Thucydides and trying to describe the US-China relationship on the basis of Sparta and Athens, I'm not sure that really is particularly helpful. Are there aspects of the so-called rising power versus the aspects of the established power that provide for some competition that may not have been there before? Of course there are. But I think there's a lot that the two countries kind of need to work on together and need the relationship for. So I'm of the view that we need to figure out how we can move forward. I'm also of the view that rather than stare at each other as in a form of marriage counseling, that rather we might look for some other issues that where we have common interests, whether it's the environment or my own favorites. You just have to pick them up and hug them, the North Koreans. So
Ah, yes.
we need to find areas where we can work and where we need to work through. I mean, that sounds pie in the sky, but you'd be surprised if you sit down with anybody and put an issue out there that you both have an interest in resolving, you'll find
Mhm.
that you have some common approaches.
Yeah, and before we leave China, we had one interesting question from a member of our board here at the FCC, from Shabani Matani from the Washington Post, who asked, do you think the Biden administration's allied-led foreign policy is working so far? What will it take to get Japan, Korea, and the European Union to act and have a unified front regarding China?
Um, I think I didn't hear properly. Was it allied led? Did you say?
Yeah, the allied-led. Biden wants this allied-led foreign policy. So, what will it take to get all these countries and the EU working
Yeah,
together
I
on China?
mean, like a lot of things, whether you're packing your car or whatever, don't put too much weight in certain areas. I think there's a lot more that the U.S. and the allies can work on together. I think, for example, some of the extraordinary difficulties the U.S. firms have had in the China market are shared by European firms, for example. And I don't think in the Trump administration's sort of bellicose America First thing, we did a particularly good job of finding out those areas of common interest. So I think there's a lot more of that can be done. I think the problem arises, geography is a stubborn thing. And when we look at, where certain countries are, that may help inform what their positions are. And so I think we need to be careful about the notion that somehow in working with allies, the allies will completely do what we completely want them to do. So I think, like a lot of things in life, there'll have to be some give and take. But there's no question that we can do more with partners and allies and create a situation where the Chinese understand that it's not just us, it's a lot of partners. And it goes back to, I'm using an environmental word, but it's really a word that can be described for relations, which is this concept of what is sustainable. And it's not sustainable to run these enormous deficits in the US. It's not, given all the transformation that we're going through, it's not sustainable to have US companies feel they have to impart technology to China. The Chinese deny that, by the way, but I think if it's kind of overwhelming when you talk to these companies. So you have to be careful about asking for too much and getting much less than you started out with.
Sure. And one last question before I go to North Korea. Should the U.S. participate in the Olympics in Beijing, in your opinion?
I err on the side. I mean, not, probably don't have 100% record on it, but I err on the side of participating in international sporting events. They don't always have the camaraderie that they're built up to have, but I err on the side that we should kind of hone to the tradition of the ancient Greeks and kind of call things off for a while we have the sports going on. That's my kind of instinctive reaction to that. It was certainly, I don't like to see Olympics turned into sort of exercises in national, excessive national pride. Let me say excessive, because there's nothing wrong with there being exhibits of national pride. But I think we ought to. I think we ought to calm down a lot of things, and maybe international is one of them. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Calm things down. And talk about North Korea for a second here. President Trump did something interesting. He decided to have a face-to-face meeting with Kim Jong-un. What did you think of that meeting? I mean, they said they fell in love. Uh, what did you think of that meeting? Did they get anything out of it? Was it worth it?
Well, first of all, to paraphrase that great political scientist, Tina Turner, what's love got to do with it? Uh, this is really, I think the issue is to try to make the case through all means necessary to make the case that North Korea has a better future without these weapons than they do with these weapons.
Hmm.
I think the problem with the Trump administration's approach, and by the way, I didn't mind that you had this summit first. I usually try to think of summits as last, you know, once everything's agreed to and the two leaders can get together, but whatever, they hadn't had meetings of any kind for a while, so why not have the two leaders meet first? But it was very clearly, I think the North Koreans got a lot out of that process, or what they were looking for. That's kind of different from getting a lot out of it. But what I didn't like was the fact that they weren't able to pursue normal negotiations after that. And I think there should have been somehow a better understanding that that's what would be required. You know, sometimes you do these things in the hopes that they will create their own momentum, and it's hard to predict whether a momentum will be created such that you'll make more progress. So you're into the realm of kind of taking a chance. Okay, we'll send our president to Singapore, and we'll kind of lay out a willingness to do a lot of things and hope this engenders in the North Koreans some sense that this process has some chance. When the North Koreans got back together with us in Hanoi, they made a proposal to do away with or abandon the whole Yongbyon facility. Yongbyon facility is a very large nuclear facility. The North Koreans were saying, of course, that they wanted all the sanctions lifted. My own view is I would have spent more than 4 hours with translation, which is what we did, listening to them. I would have brought out my own maps of Yongbyon. I would have said, okay, what are you doing with building 1? What are you doing with building 2? I would have really understood what it is they're talking about, and that would have frankly taken days. Then I might have offered some partial for partial and see if we can get anywhere. But you know, when I was off doing these things, everything I did, you know, you get some critic, never in the Washington Post, but elsewhere, you would get criticism that, oh, what's he doing? And, you know, as if I'm negotiating with air and it's that easy just to, you know, say what you, get what you want. These are tough negotiations, so I don't want to second guess people, but I will say at the end of this whole personalized reality TV negotiation with the North Koreans, I don't think we have much to show for it. But for those who worry about that, I can also add that I don't think the North Koreans have much to show for it either.
Yeah, well, can I ask you, are China and the U.S. at least on the same page when it comes to North Korea? Can we work with China to get a deal on North Korea?
My view is yes, we can. There are those who say, oh, the Chinese kind of like it this way. They like to kind of entangle us in these nasty little things that result in spats with our own allies and somehow cause problems for us. I don't think that the only nuclear sanctioned, the only country that has nuclear weapons, according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty in East Asia, is China. And I don't think the Chinese are particularly interested in having North Korea join that club. I think the issue for China is an issue that they've been thinking about for decades, and they'll probably think about for a long time to follow, is the question of if too much pressure is put on North Korea, what happens to North Korea? And if North Korea, if there's a if the Korean Peninsula is unified, what would this mean for Chinese interests? And what would this mean even for the perception of Chinese interests? Would this engender more domestic disputes within China, where there's criticism of you've forsaken our one ally on the Korean Peninsula, you've worsened our strategic position? Could there be enough assurance from the US side that no, we would never take a strategic advantage? All kinds of questions that I think require a lot of discussion with the Chinese. And I think the problem is that it's going to be long-term discussions and ones that don't kind of fit the idea that when you come to the Chinese, you get a Christmas tree and hang a lot of ornaments and things you want taken care of, and the Chinese do the same, and then you kind of add it up and it looks like a sports score, and then you say you've lost or something. So I think we do need to have these kind of what-if discussions and see if we can come to an understanding with the Chinese that we need to get North Korea to abandon these weapons. By the way, I just one little aside, I don't think this is just about the North Koreans saying that they they need them for their survival, which is a favorite expression. I think it's a little more nefarious than that. I think they want to be the country on the Korean Peninsula with nuclear weapons as a means in the longer run to decouple the US from that situation, meaning that do we want troops on the Korean Peninsula when one side is pushing and shoving and actually talking about tactical nuclear weapons? Obviously, we could respond and respond robustly to any threat from North Korea, no question. But I think the North Koreans have some kind of vague notion that if they can just get the US troops off the Korean Peninsula, somehow things will go more their way, and they need to be disabused of that in a big hurry.
We've got a couple of really good questions on North Korea from our colleague and fellow FCC board member, Christy Lou Stout from CNN. She says, well, the first question is, North Korea has not tested a nuclear weapon or an ICBM since 2017, although they've tested shorter range nuclear missiles, including after the Hanoi summit. Will North Korea, do you think, test a nuke or an ICBM again? And if so, when might they do that?
You know, when we were negotiating with the North Koreans from 2005 through 2008, the only time they ever tested was when the talks had broken down during 2006. So I think there is a kind of North Korean understanding that when you're talking, you shouldn't be testing. So that argues for having some kind of process going forward. Obviously, it has to be a process that's agreed on both sides and something that makes sense. So that kind of argues for trying to continue to talk. But I think people need to be a little more aware of something that we know less about, which is when you have a development program, testing is part of a development program. But when those tests take place, depend on a lot of technical aspects of the development program. So I cannot answer the question, do the North Koreans need to test in order to take a step forward with their development program, or are they kind of okay for now and that's why they haven't been testing? So I think we need to be careful with the idea that somehow it's a great accomplishment that they haven't tested. It may just be that's not the phase of the development program they're in, because they could say at some point, we're going to test and make up some reason for why they, political reason for why they are testing. So I guess I'd be a little careful about drawing heavy duty conclusions on the basis that they're not testing.
Sure. And Christy Lou Stout from CNN also asked the question, should there be a resumption of the six-party talks? And would that work given the greater friction now between the US and China as the main guy at the six-party talks? What would you say?
Well, the Biden administration is having a soup to nuts review of all this. And, should we have multilateral? Should it be 6? Should it be 8? Should it be 108? What kind of process going forward? So I'm just going to speak very personally uh, between me and however many people are in your audience. I, I just feel that it's good to work with partners and allies, because when you're just doing it bilaterally, the dynamic ends up with the North Koreans going to other partners and allies of ours and saying, we'd be willing to do more, but the Americans were mean to us yesterday. And then before you know it, the partners and allies who weren't there tell us, oh, be nicer to the North Koreans. And before you know it, you have all this issue of whether there are nuances among the partners and allies. So I'm from the view, hey, bring them to the table and let them see what we have to deal with here.
Mhm.
Always been my point. And then I do believe that we've got to figure out a way to restart some patterns of cooperation with China, difficult as that seems, and certainly the question implies. But I just feel that if we can, and I'm basing this on the fact that US ROK relations were much better for having the 6-party talks than they were before having the 6-party talks, where we'd fly off to North Korea and they'd stand at the airport waiting for us to come back to tell them what's going on in their peninsula. I think it was a good thing to have them shoulder to shoulder with us in the talks. And I think the same goes for China. So I kind of hope for some kind of multilateral, but we'll see what the administration wants to do.
And final question from Chrissy Lou Stout from CNN. It's very simple. What does North Korea want?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I think I don't think survival is really what they want. I think obviously everyone wants survival. I think what they want is to create a circumstance where if they don't hollow out the US-ROK alliance by holding their breath until they turn purple over issues like exercises. These are exercises that are basically tabletop exercises. And when you have a military alliance, that doesn't mean your troops should just be, playing volleyball with each other. I mean, they need to exercise. The whole point is to have exercises so we know what each army can do in the event of something we don't want to see happen, but for which we would be ready. So I think they want to weaken our alliance, and ultimately they would like to see us off the Korean Peninsula. And I realize over time they've said things like, oh, we actually want you on the Korean Peninsula. And they make these kind of odd comments. But, I would not take to the bank, I would not assume that every time the North Koreans say something to you, it's true.
And we got to, yeah, don't trust everything the North Koreans say or tweet. Then I'll remember that.
Yeah.
We have a few questions because you in your previous capacity as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, we got a lot of questions about Myanmar, what's going on, how you see it, what's happening. I mean, can you just give us an overview first? How do you see what's going on there, and what leverage does the U.S. have?
Well, that is an extremely frustrating issue, let me say at the outset. If you go back to the 1950s, Myanmar was considered the country most likely to succeed. It has not, and for reasons that are, I think, very internal to Myanmar, has not been a success. During my watch, I was very sympathetic to ASEAN countries who took the view that, look, Americans, you understand this is a human rights issue, so do we, but we also understand that it is a geopolitical issue, and we think the best future for Myanmar should be within the ASEAN family. I think that's a pretty positive way to look at it. And so I was hopeful that with the changes that took place in ASEAN, I'm sorry, in Myanmar, that we would see uh, more efforts to integrate with the other ASEAN countries. Instead, I think this coup has taken an enormous step backwards, um, and the loss of life has been horrific. Uh, in short, it's not an issue that we can just stand by and say, well, what do you expect? I think there needs to be a strategy to deal with it. Uh, as some of my other comments on other areas would suggest, I think we need a strategy where we work with others. I think we need envoys involved, and I think we need that Burma and ASEAN and then Myanmar understands that this is leading nowhere. How you fit sanctions into this, I think too often we look at sanctions as a panacea. Their track record is not all that positive, and the broader they are, the more they hurt innocent people. So I would suggest being very careful how we deal with sanctions, but I think that has to be part of the recipe. But I think another aspect of it is going to have to be some kind of negotiation. And Myanmar, uh, I can remember during my time, they often think of themselves as a pretty big country with a lot of sway politically, strategically. I think they have to understand that no one supports them in the direction they're going. And I think we need a lot of discussions in the region, including with India and China, and of course our ASEAN partners. I don't have any easy recipes for this, but all I can say is this is on all of us, including the ASEAN countries, and I think we all have to kind of pitch in together and see what common strategy can be brought to bear, because ASEAN has to live, Myanmar has to live somewhere, and it can't just live alone. It certainly can't live alone for long. So I hope we can work with others on this.
Yeah, Christy Lou Stout mentioned, for example, she said international isolation did not really work with North Korea.
Yeah.
Could it possibly work with Myanmar? Yeah.
Yeah, international isolation, it's often tried. Um, there's there's an American fairy tale book about a rabbit, and he says, "Don't throw me in the briar patch." And of course, they finally throw him in the briar patch, and of course, the briar patch is where he lives, and he loves it. And I think throwing these countries into international isolation is exactly what they want. And so I think we need to be careful of that, and we need to make sure these countries understand there's no Myanmar exceptionalism. Frankly, there's no North Korean exceptionalism. They have to live by the standards that the rest of us aspire to in various degrees. But I think isolation kind of gives them a free pass, weirdly. So I think we need to be careful of that as a solution to everything.
We had a question here from Alejandro Reyes. I'm going to ask that, then I'm going to ask my own question on top of that. Alejandro Reyes, a member of the FCC, asked, he says, you started your diplomatic career in the Peace Corps. How would you assess the state of U.S. soft power in the world? And I was gonna tag on to that to say, how much damage has the Trump administration done to the professional foreign service, and can that be rebuilt?
Yeah,
if you could take those as one question, kind of.
Yeah, and it's a fair question. It's awkward, I think, for any American to be talking to a foreign audience about it, but it's certainly a fair question. And I used to say the Trump administration would talk about diplomacy, but they seem to want to carry on diplomacy without any diplomats. And I had a problem with that. And they also seem to think that diplomacy was a function of getting countries to do exactly what we wanted them to do. And that's not how it works. If you can get countries to go along with you on more than 50% of the issues, you're doing well. And so I think there has to be an understanding that leadership involves listening as well as talking. Leadership also involves setting a good example. And, as you pointed out earlier, Keith, we've sometimes fallen down on our example. I don't want to say it's fatal, but we've got to pay attention to some of these issues, including our economy and including some of our domestic issues, especially this sort of domestic political divide. You know, I've been around long enough to know that many people have counted out America on many occasions, but usually because of our economy. But now people are counting us out because of our inability to reach kind of domestic political consensus. So we have to do better on that. But all that said, I think America is a country that the world needs and wants to be a part of the world. You know, sometimes America has, you know, has maybe a surplus of advice that countries don't really need. But I must say, it's like the old Woody Allen joke about the restaurant, which is that the food is terrible, and besides the portions are too small. You know, they don't like what we prepare, but then they seem to want bigger portions of it. So we have a lot of work to do, but we have, I think, a real reservoir of goodwill in the world. And I certainly found this, to go back to that Peace Corps question. I mean, I was in West Africa, a country called Cameroon. I had a Suzuki 125 dirt bike, and I went around to village and plantation credit unions, little banks that I audited the money, make sure everything was there. When if there were too many loans, I said so. And sometimes I wasn't always diplomatic, but I learned a lot. But I'll tell you, there's one thing I learned in the Peace Corps, and which is that I couldn't pick other people's leaders for them. I couldn't come into some little village bank and say, you got to get rid of these people leading this thing, because lo and behold, I'd recommend someone, they'd vote someone else in. So you got to be very careful about thinking that you could tell another country or another credit union who their leadership should be. So I learned that at the age of 22. And I think the United States understands that. And we understand that it's not a question of changing regimes. It's more a question of changing an international environment in which countries who have aspirations to be big and grow and be important have to deal with that international environment. I like to think we're back on that track, and I hope we will continue to go forward on that.
One quick last question from me. We've gone through 4 years of an administration that denigrated journalists, and you're speaking to the Foreign Correspondents Club here in Hong Kong. How important is it for the U.S. to stand up for press freedom? Do you think that's a value that the U.S. should be talking about? What's your view on what's been going on in the last few years on this issue of fake news and accusing us of being enemies of the people?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it would surprise you or anyone else that I have an enormous problem with this criticism. I have enormous problems with the notion that somehow the press are somehow illegitimate in this process. I have an enormous problem with just the sheer rudeness that would be encountered from the podium in the White House toward journalists. There is no question the press has undergone a lot of very difficult transitions brought on by technology, brought on by business models, et cetera, et cetera. There's no question that the issue of press credentials, who's a professional, who's not. I mean, those are issues that people need to address. It's you are engaged in one of the most competitive industries in the world. My own view is when you see that, I try to revert to press outlets that know how to do it, know how to do it right. But that's not for me to tell other people to do. So I'm of the view that this has been a very bad 4 years in that regard. But I'm also of the view, as I said, diplomats, we like to look forward, not backwards, not backwards to litigation, but forward to a brighter future. So I think we'll do the right thing. We've certainly tried every other approach. So, I like to think we're going forward. And by the way, I think if you look at how, this goes to a domestic issue in the US, how our country managed the whole challenge of this previous administration, I think there's tremendous evidence for the fact that certain institutions stepped up big time. And one of those institutions was the American press.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Hill. Can you tell us before you go, what books are you reading, or what book can you recommend for our members?
Well, all right. I'm teaching a course at Columbia. By the way, the students are very, very smart. And the one I'm reading, that's just over here, is a book that was written a while ago, but it was called Assassin's Gate, and it's by one of my favorite authors, George Packer. Packer most recently wrote a book about my mentor and my tormentor, that is Richard Holbrooke. And really one of the fabulous books, but I read it when it came out, so about a year ago. And now I'm kind of going back and reading some other stuff that George Packer did. And what I found fascinating in this book called Assassin's Gate, it's about Iraq and a place that I served after I finished with North Korea. I thought to myself, gee, I never thought it could get worse than dealing with North Koreans. And then I went to Iraq. And Packer really, I think, brilliantly not only analyzes the situation in Iraq, but analyzes the situation in the US that could have led to a policy of invading Iraq. So that's what I'm reading right now. And I've also started Bob Zellick's book on American diplomacy. I can't remember the name, but it just came out of, I don't know, 6 months ago or so. And he's got a lot of examples. Basically, he doesn't use this term, but there are many people who think American diplomacy is some kind of oxymoron. And what is good about Zellick's book is it shows that, hey, we've been at this for a while and we're actually pretty good at it. So I've been enjoying that one as well. And the problem in life is there's just so many books and so little time.
So many books and so little time. And Ambassador Chris Hill. So we've got Assassin's Gate. We've got Bob Zellick's book. The first speaker we've had, to quote Tina Turner as a source, what's love got to do with it? Thank you. Good morning to you, Ambassador Chris Hill. Good evening to everybody who's watching. Thank you for joining us in this latest in the series of FCC Zoom Talks. Ambassador Hill, promise us you will come to Hong Kong and visit us in person when we can have persons in person.
With pleasure, and I won't just stay in the airport business lounge, which is really a very nice place as well.
All right, you got it. Invitation to Ambassador Chris Hill to the FCC in Hong Kong. Thank you, and thank you all for watching. Please come and stay in touch with fcchk.org. Find out about our future Zoom event. And this event will be live on will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So thank you, Ambassador Hill. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.